In the years after World War II, the United States Air Force faced a problem that seemed unsolvable. The new generation of nuclear bombers could fly higher and farther than anything before them, but they were slow, heavy, and completely vulnerable to faster enemy fighters. The Pentagon needed a way to protect these bombers on long missions across hostile territory, and the solution they came up with was straight out of science fiction. What if a bomber could carry its own escort fighters inside it, release them mid-air to defend itself, and then pull them back in before returning home? A flying fortress that launched smaller aircraft from its belly, an airborne aircraft carrier. The project was called Parasite Fighter Program, and the plane chosen to make it real would become one of the smallest jet fighters ever built, the Northrop XF-85 Goblin. The idea wasn't born in the jet age. It dated back to the 1930s when the U.S. Navy experimented with launching tiny biplanes from airships like the U.S. Macon and Akron. Those projects ended in disaster when both airships crashed, but the dream of an airborne carrier never fully died. When the Cold War began, it returned, more ambitious, more secret, and much faster. In 1946, engineers at Northrop were asked to design a fighter so compact that it could fit inside the bomb bay of the Convair B-36 Peacemaker, the largest bomber ever conceived. That bomber was still under development, but the Air Force already knew it would be slow and unarmed, the perfect target for Soviet interceptors. It needed its own defenders. Northrop's answer was radical: a 14-foot-long jet with no landing gear, no tailhook, and no external fuel tanks. It would be carried inside the bomber, attached to a retractable trapeze arm. Once enemy aircraft were detected, the bomber would drop the fighter through its belly. The Goblin would ignite its engine, engage the enemy, then hook back onto the trapeze and be pulled inside again. Like a wasp returning to its nest, on paper, it was genius. In reality, it was nearly impossible. The aircraft that emerged in 1948 looked more like a bullet than a plane. The XF-85 Goblin weighed less than 4,000 pounds, about one-fourth the weight of a typical fighter. Its stubby wings measured only 21 feet across, and its entire body was smooth and rounded for easy storage inside a bomber's bay. It was powered by a single Westinghouse J-34 turbojet engine, producing 3,000 pounds of thrust, enough to push the tiny plane past 1,000 kilometers per hour. But because it had no landing gear, every flight was a one-way ticket. If it couldn't reconnect to the bomber midair, the pilot would have to deploy a steel skid and belly land on the desert floor. The Goblin's cockpit was tiny and cramped. The pilot sat barely inches away from the nose, surrounded by little more than aluminum and glass. Behind him, the engine howled. The first test pilot chosen for this strange mission was Major Edward "Ed" Schock, a decorated World War II veteran who had flown everything from Mustangs to early jets. In August 1948, the first Goblin prototype was loaded into a modified B-29 Superfortress, standing in for the future B-36. At 20,000 feet, the bomber opened its bomb bay doors. The trapeze arm extended downward, and the Goblin, this tiny metallic egg, hung in the open sky, waiting for release. Then came the first drop. The Goblin fell free, its engine roaring to life. For a few shining seconds, it flew smoothly, light and responsive, as if it belonged there. Then came the real challenge: hooking back onto the trapeze. Schock approached carefully, aligning his nose with the trapeze's guidance bar. But the turbulence from the mothership made the Goblin shake violently. Each time he tried to latch on, the slipstream pushed him away. Finally, the plane's nose struck the trapeze hard. The canopy cracked. Fuel sprayed into the cockpit. Schock regained control and made a desperate emergency landing on a dry lake bed, sliding hundreds of feet before stopping. He stepped out unhurt, but the Goblin was battered. It was only the beginning. Over the next 2 months, the Goblin would fly 6 test missions. Each flight proved one thing: launching was easy, recovery was a nightmare. The B-29's massive weight created unpredictable air currents that tossed the Goblin like a leaf. Even when Schock managed to hook on, The turbulence ripped the connection loose. The risk to pilots was enormous. By October 1948, the Air Force suspended further testing. At the same time, air-to-air refueling technology was rapidly improving. Fighters could now extend their range without needing to be carried inside a bomber. The Goblin suddenly looked unnecessary, a relic of a problem already solved by fuel hoses and tankers. By 1949, the project was officially canceled. Both prototypes were mothballed, their paint faded, their cockpits sealed shut. The dream of a flying aircraft carrier died quietly, replaced by more practical technologies. But the story didn't end there. Even though the Goblin never made it into service, it left behind a strange legacy. It proved that airborne docking between aircraft was technically possible, though extremely dangerous. The lessons learned from its failures directly influenced later projects like the FICON, Fighter Conveyor Program, which tested carrying full-size RF-84 fighters inside B-36 bombers during the 1950s. That, too, would fail for similar reasons: turbulence, complexity, and the risk of midair accidents. Yet the concept continued to haunt military engineers for decades. In the 1960s, the Soviets tried their own version, the Tupolev-Zveno project, and in modern times, the U.S. has revisited the idea in drone form today. DARPA and the U.S. Air Force are testing autonomous drones that can launch and return to a carrier aircraft. The very idea born in the XF-85's short, turbulent life. The Goblin's influence also extended to ideas about rapid deployment of fighters in combat zones. The Air Force studied the potential for airborne delivery of interceptors, reconnaissance planes, and even rescue vehicles, all inspired by the same trapeze mechanism. While none of these projects reached production, they demonstrated that a single concept could ripple through decades of aerospace. Thinking engineers dissected every flight, analyzing turbulence effects, stress points on the fuselage, and stability during the delicate docking procedure. They experimented with adjustments to the trapeze arm, testing angles, lengths, and shock absorption, learning the exact tolerances required for high-speed docking. Each failure provided data for safer, more practical applications in later programs. The human aspect was just as striking. Pilots like Schock faced unprecedented challenges, flying aircraft no larger than a compact car at high speeds beneath massive bombers. They endured physical strain, psychological stress, and the constant threat of death if the hook failed. Their courage highlighted the intersection of innovation and human endurance. Standing in a museum today, the Goblin looks almost comical, a shiny yellow teardrop with stubby wings and a gaping air intake. But for a brief moment in 1948, it represented the cutting edge of human imagination. It was the dream of a sky without limits, where even bombers could become carriers, and the air itself could be a battlefield. Every time the trapeze extended from the belly of the B-29, and the Goblin hung there waiting for release, it symbolized something larger: the post-war world's reckless confidence in technology, the belief that every problem could be engineered away. The Goblin wasn't just a failed plane, it was the reflection of a new age, daring, ambitious, and slightly mad. In the end, only 2 XF-85 Goblins were ever built. Both survived. One sits at the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, gleaming under hangar lights. The other rests quietly at the Strategic Air Command Museum in Nebraska. They are all that's left of a dream that once hovered above the clouds, the dream of a flying aircraft carrier. The project cost millions, risked lives, and achieved nothing militarily. But in the long shadow of the Cold War, it told a deeper story, that progress always comes with failure first. Every jet that flew afterward, every experiment that reached space, owed something to those strange years when men believed that even a bomber could launch its own defenders. The Goblin never fired a shot, never fought a battle, and never made history in its own time. But today, decades later, it stands as one of the boldest and strangest creations of the 20th century. A reminder that some ideas, no matter how impossible, were simply too beautiful not to try. Beyond its immediate military goals, The XF-85 Goblin inspired new thinking about aircraft design, compact engineering, and extreme aerodynamics. Designers experimented with lightweight alloys, high-thrust engines, and space-saving layouts. These principles would later influence drone development, reusable spacecraft, and compact fighter prototypes. The Goblin also highlighted the importance of human factors in aviation design. Pilots had to manage high-speed, high-risk maneuvers with limited cockpit space, testing reflexes, and decision-making under stress. The lessons learned contributed to ergonomics, cockpit instrumentation, and safety protocols in subsequent fighter programs. While the concept of a flying aircraft carrier never returned in its original form, the dream lives on in autonomous drones, aerial refueling, and modular aircraft systems. Modern engineers still study the Goblin, not for replication, but for inspiration. Proof that audacity and imagination can push technology in directions once thought impossible.